So they got me on the floor next to the safe I had in there. Open up the safe.
They shot 6 people. 3 died, 3 lived.
In the mid-'80s Queens, money was flowing faster than the police could count. But every hustler feared this one man that wasn't building an empire but tearing them down, Henry RonDu Bolden.
His government name is Henry Bolden, but they call him RonDu because he had knowledge of self too.
He robbed Harlem's golden boy, Azie Faison. He even dared to cross Queens' kingpin, Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols.
His man come out the room and put the gun to my forehead, and I watched him pull the trigger. And my spirit left the body, bro.
In the shadows, his name carried the weight of a death sentence.
These man's gonna sit up there 112 years to life. Was it worth it?
But RonDu wasn't just reckless. He was the inevitable product of a world that raised predators. And his story proves what happens when violence becomes the only way forward. Let's talk about it. In Queens, you had the hustlers and you had the wolves. The hustlers were guys like Azie Faison, Rich Porter, Alpo, and Fat Cat Nichols. They were businessmen in their own way. Slick cars, gold chains, always counting money. They flipped into empires, building crews and controlling entire neighborhoods. They weren't just making money, they were symbols. Proof that you could climb out of poverty if you were willing to risk it all.
He gave me some work. I took it to the streets. And next thing you know, I'm in the game, bro. I'm in the game. Overnight success.
Then there were the stick-up kids. The wolves. These weren't the ones counting bricks or running supply chains. These were the ones watching from the shadows, waiting for a hustler to get too comfortable. Stick-up kids didn't want the fame, they wanted the fast score. And their weapon wasn't distribution, it was fear. Henry RonDu Bolden was one of those wolves. He grew up in the same environment as the hustlers, saw the same money flying around Queens. But he didn't build his name through deals. He built it through taking. While Fat Cat was organizing crews and Azie was stacking paper uptown, RonDu represented the other side of the game, the side that reminded hustlers that their wealth wasn't guaranteed.
I don't understand why anybody have to die, get murdered, or have their life taken, bro. For drugs? For money?
Because the truth is, in that era, no one was safe. You could be on top one day, and by nightfall, lose everything in a stick-up. And the hustlers knew it. That's why they rolled with armed security, why they kept crews around them, why paranoia was part of everyday life. But Bolden wasn't intimidated by that. In fact, he thrived on it. Police corruption only made it worse. Cops weren't stopping the drug trade. Half the time, they were in on it. Some were robbing the very same hustlers they were supposed to be locking up, flipping kilos back to the streets for profit. It was the Dirty 30 era, when you couldn't tell the difference between a badge and a stick-up. So imagine being a teenager in Queens at that time. Your school is underfunded, your family can't keep the lights on, and every night you walk past cars, you'll never afford parked outside the homes of drug dealers who are barely older than you. The choices came fast. Do you hustle? Do you stick somebody up? Or do you risk starving? For RonDu, the answer was simple. He wasn't going to starve. The Bolden name should have meant something different. Their father, Reverend Henry Bolden, stood in the pulpit of a Bronx Baptist church, preaching salvation and discipline. But outside those church doors, in the cracked sidewalks and dim hallways of the Claremont projects, the sermon didn't carry. Poverty spoke louder. Hunger spoke louder. The streets raised Henry RonDu Bolden and his brothers in a language their father couldn't translate. By the early 70s, after the divorce left their mother raising them alone on public assistance, the Boldens had already begun slipping through every safety net. School programs, crisis centers, juvenile services, none of it stuck. They ran from it all. A court official later summed it up in one sentence. The system had absolutely guaranteed that the Boldens would not make it. The Claremont houses weren't just poor, they were a breeding ground for wolves. The Timmons twins, infamous for pioneering the push-in robbery, prowled the same address at 1420 Washington Avenue. It was an environment where cruelty wasn't an outlier, it was the standard, and the Boldens fit right in. Each brother carved his niche in crime. Curtis, the oldest, would rob anyone, even the elderly. Ernest, a junkie, was still ruthless when the habit called. Robert, the youngest, was constantly overcompensating with violence to prove he belonged. But Henry was something else. Alongside his cousin Isaac, just me, he built a reputation not just for robbing, but for hunting the most dangerous prey of all, drug dealers. They became known as the godfathers of crib robberies, men who stormed homes with weapons drawn, knowing their targets couldn't call the cops even if they wanted to.
They wanted that fast money. And what they did is they went out there and they started jumping on any drug dealer that they feel that was out there that was making money.
Henry's first mark of distinction came early. His rap sheet stretched back to the 60s. But the crime that defined his character happened in 1977. At just 17, he and an accomplice robbed an 84-year-old man and his 74-year-old wife. The old man's teeth were ripped from his mouth during the attack. Court records put it in plain text. When Bolden showed up to court for sentencing, he was laughing. Not nervous laughter, not embarrassed laughter, but cold, defiant laughter, joined by his friends in the back row. It was the kind of reaction that showed how far gone he already was. A predator disconnected from the notion of consequence. He was sentenced to 8 to 25 years, but that time didn't rehabilitate him, it hardened him. By the time he came back out in the mid-80s, the crack era was booming. New York had become a gold rush where rocks of coke turned teenagers into overnight millionaires, but it also turned them into targets. Dealers lived paranoid lives, stacking money in shoeboxes and basements, knowing wolves were watching. Henry RonDu Bolden was one of those wolves. He didn't build empires, he specialized in tearing them down. Stick-ups were also how he asserted dominance. If you could rob a kingpin and walk away breathing, your reputation soared higher than anyone selling drugs on the corner. The Bolden brothers were described by police and prosecutors as a one-family crime wave. Detectives said wherever they lived, crime flourished. They weren't bound by rules, crews, or loyalty. They weren't workers under a drug lord, they were independent raiders. RonDu wasn't afraid to hit names that others whispered about with caution. Fat Cat, Azie, Harlem hustlers, Queens bosses. To him, they weren't legends, they were cash registers waiting to be cracked open. This was the code of the Stickup Kid. Heartless, brazen, living score to score. Bolden thrived in intimidation. Violence wasn't a byproduct of his robberies. It was part of the method. Fear made people freeze and comply, and fear made his name echo in neighborhoods where hustlers thought they were untouchable. The irony was heavy. Drug dealers, who already lived like prey in a jungle of rivals, became prey again in the hands of the Boldens. And one of those that fell prey is Lorenzo Nichols. By the mid-1980s, Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols was the king of Jamaica, running one of the most feared and organized drug operations in the country. Even locked in a cell, his word carried farther than most men's guns. The streets knew that if you crossed Fat Cat, you didn't just invite trouble, you invited death. That's why Henry RonDu Bolden's decision to rob him still shocks people to this day. To most who knew the game, it looked like straight suicide.
Who the real boss of Queens was.
Huh.
That's like when you sit there and you listen to Preem and you listen to Cat, you know, that's on the South Side that they did stuff.
Yeah.
But there's a person that was over all of them. And that's the thing that's never been told.
But RonDu wasn't wired like everyone else. He wasn't building empires or plotting longevity. His hustle was quick hits, violent stick-ups, living on the edge of the moment. And through family ties, he found the unthinkable opportunity. Fat Cat's girlfriend, Lennon. She was trusted with holding hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time, a role that meant you had Fat Cat's confidence, and by extension, his protection. That stash should have been untouchable. But inside Betrayal cracked the door open. The betrayal came from RonDu's own blood, his cousin Isaac, Just Me Bolden. Just Me had been a childhood friend of Fat Cat. After prison, Fat Cat gave him money, a car, a job, which set him up with stability in a world where loyalty was supposed to mean everything. But when RonDu came around whispering about scores, temptation won out. Just Me pointed him to Lennon's house. His one condition, no killing, keep it clean, get in, get out. Nobody hurt. That condition didn't last long. On a quiet Long Island street, two of Fat Cat's men, Bobo and Jughead, delivered cash to Lennon's home. Minutes later, masked gunmen jumped from the bushes. One of them was RonDu. They stormed inside, forcing everyone down, guns pressed against skulls. Lennon was pistol whipped, the house torn apart. When they left, they carried more than $500,000 in cash, plus jewelry. In the world of stick-ups, that was a career-defining score, but money wasn't the only thing taken that day. RonDu, in the chaos, slipped. He lifted his mask. Jughead, lying cuffed on the floor, couldn't see him directly, but across the room, a mirror caught the image. One glance was all it took. Jughead knew the face and the name. He recognized him from prison. Henry Ron Duke Bolden. That mistake sealed the Bolden's fate. Word moved fast. In Fat Cat's world, there was no pause. No, let's figure it out. From inside prison, he still commanded soldiers. He tapped the Supreme Team, one of the most notorious crews in Queens, to handle the retaliation. Their leader, Gerald Prince Miller, wasted no time. Two corrupt parole employees, one an officer, the other a secretary, were bought off for $3,000. In return, they handed over the home addresses of Henry and Isaac Bolden. The consequences hit almost immediately. On August 7th, 1987, Isaac Just Me Bolden was standing by his brown Cadillac outside his mother's place in Jamaica. Gunmen pulled up and opened fire. 4 bullets tore through him before he collapsed. He was rushed to Jamaica Hospital but didn't survive. For Fat Cat, the debt had been paid in blood, at least halfway. RonDu was next. They came for him in the Bronx, ambushing his address, but somehow he slipped through. He wasn't untouched. He was a marked man now, living in the shadow of death. From that moment forward, every breath was borrowed time. Even Fat Cat himself, years later, admitted the complexity of what happened. "I loved just," he said, reflecting on the betrayal, "but he gave me no choice. It was the law of the jungle." For him, it wasn't just about money stolen. It was about respect broken, trust shattered. That kind of offense had only one remedy. 2 weeks after his cousin's murder, Henry RonDu Bolden wasn't grieving. He was scheming. The streets didn't know pause. And if anything, the loss only sharpened his appetite. In August 1987, he linked up with Ronald Ace Timmons, a man as violent and unpredictable as himself, and Kevin Clark. Clark was the key. He wasn't just some neighborhood hanger-on. He was dating Azie Faison's sister. That meant he had access. He knew where the money was supposed to be, and he knew Azie trusted him. The betrayal cut deep. Azie had set Clark up with a block, a car, and $15,000. It was the kind of opportunity most hustlers dreamed of, but Clark didn't see a blessing. He saw a ceiling. In Azie's own words years later, Clark must have been thinking, "Damn, if he set me up like this, how much he got?" The plan was simple. Hit Azie's stash spot, an apartment in the Bronx belonging to his aunt, and walk out richer than they had ever been. On the day of the robbery, Azie wasn't sitting still. He was uptown playing ball for $5,000. By the time he wrapped up, he headed straight to the Bronx to grab a half kilo from the safe at his aunt's place. He had no idea that upstairs, men in masks were already waiting. The setup was tight. The robbers had the drop. Guns out, faces covered, voices raised. At first, it looked like a clean stick-up. Take the drugs, take the cash, get out. But then came the fatal mistake. Azie, face down on the floor, recognized something familiar in one of the voices. "Kev, what you doing, man?" The room froze. Kevin Clark ripped off his mask in panic. In that 1 second, the robbery shifted from a hustle to a massacre. Clark snapped. He shouted to the others, "You said my name! Kill everyone in this apartment!"
He tell his man, "Yo, take him in the room, murder him." The dude take me in the room, put the pillow over my head, put the gun to my head, and I start talking like, "Listen, fam, it ain't no money in the safe, bro."
Gunfire erupted. 25 shots tore through the living room and bedrooms. People dropped where they stood. Azie's aunt, Myra Enoch, 50 years old, was killed instantly. Joan Blue, a 44-year-old family friend, and Charles Parker, 23, never made it out either. Michael Lamar was shot 5 times. A 13-year-old girl, Lynette Bell, took 2 bullets to the head and somehow survived. And Azie, he was hit 9 times. 2 in the head, 1 in the neck, 1 in the shoulder, his leg shattered by more bullets. The aftermath was chaos. Neighbors heard the shots. Paramedics rushed the scene. Azie was barely breathing when they carried him out. To this day, he talks about that moment with a tone that's more resignation than anger, like he already knew betrayal was part of the game. The cruel irony is that for all the blood spilled, the take was pathetic. $5,000 or $6,000 in cash, a $15,000 chain, that was it. No bricks, no safe full of money. The so-called jackpot turned out to be pocket change compared to what they expected. The shockwave that followed wasn't just about the killings. It was about who they robbed. Azie wasn't a small-timer. He was Harlem royalty, tied to Rich Porter, connected to a whole network of hustlers with serious muscle. To hit him and leave him for dead was reckless beyond measure. It was a power move that no one in Harlem could ignore. Dealers already lived paranoid lives. But this was different. This was family betrayal, a sister's boyfriend turning wolf. This was armed men storming into the home of one of Harlem's top wholesalers and leaving bodies on the floor. The robbery was whispered about in corners, replayed in barbershops, turned into legend in jail cells. It was the stick-up heard around Harlem, from the streets to the screen. Even when Paid in Full hit theaters in 2002, people knew it was a retelling of Harlem during this drug era, a dramatization of Azie Faison, Rich Porter, and Alpo Martinez's rise and fall. But beneath the surface, the film also pulled from a wider pool of New York street lore. Characters were composites, exaggerations, fragments of stories stitched together for narrative impact. And tucked inside that tapestry was Henry RonDu Bolden. The man didn't get his name in the credits, but his presence was there. His reputation as a stick-up kid, reckless enough to rob both Azie and Fat Cat, was folded into the film's character, Calvin, played by Kevin Carroll.
I'm hooking you up. You got money in your pocket? I'll deal the block. It's my block. No, you can't do that.
Calvin was the neighborhood stick-up man, the guy who lurked in the shadows until it was time to make a violent move. He wasn't a major player like Ace, Mitch, or Rico, but he served a purpose. He was the embodiment of the kind of predators who circled the drug trade, living off the risks others took. And for those who knew RonDu's history, Calvin's storyline felt eerily familiar. In the film, Calvin tries to muscle his way into Ace's success. He's not interested in building something or maintaining alliances. He wants the quick score, the easy way in, the smash and grab that defines short-term hustlers. That was RonDu to the core. He wasn't cut from the same cloth as Azie or Rich, who at least imagined themselves as businessmen. RonDu was the guy who would break into your aunt's apartment stash house, mask on, gun drawn, and take everything you thought was secure. It didn't matter if it was Fat Cat's cash or Azie's cocaine. If he saw an opening, he took it. The parallels didn't stop at behavior. Even the betrayal woven into Calvin's role, using trust to get close, then flipping it for personal gain, echoed the Bolden family's choices. RonDu didn't just pull stick-ups against faceless marks. He turned on people who had fed his cousin, clothed him, and welcomed him into their circle. Fat Cat had helped Isaac Just Me Bolden back on his feet after prison. Azie thought his Harlem stash spot was safe. Both found themselves violated because RonDu didn't play by unspoken rules. That's exactly what Calvin represented in the film. The person you should never have trusted, but somehow let too close. What's interesting is how Paid in Full handled that kind of character. Calvin wasn't glorified. He wasn't made into a kingpin or a flashy figure. He was a reminder of how fragile success in the drug game really was. You could have the cars, the money, the reputation, but one desperate man with a gun could undo it all in a single night. That was the reality of RonDu's world. But here's where the lines blur. Movies have a way of mythologizing people. The name Calvin might not stick the way Alpo or Mitch does, but for people in Harlem and Queens who lived through the 1980s, they recognize the DNA of RonDu in that character. They could see the inspiration, even if most viewers couldn't. And over time, this mix of reality and fiction made it harder to separate fact from legend. Was Calvin really RonDu? Was he a mix of several stick-up kids? Or was he just a narrative tool that happened to mirror Bolden's moves. The truth is, it doesn't matter much. In the world of New York street legends, perception carries as much weight as reality. Once people start connecting dots, saying Calvin was based on RonDu, it becomes part of the mythology. For a man like Henry Bolden, who left more scars than stories behind, that myth almost becomes bigger than the truth. And maybe that's fitting, because RonDu wasn't remembered for building anything lasting. When Henry "RonDu" Bolden eventually went on trial, the courtroom became a stage. By the time his case came before Bronx Supreme Court Justice Lawrence Tanetti, the streets already knew the outcome. The stick-up kid who robbed Harlem legends and Queens kingpins wasn't walking free. The question wasn't if, but how hard the hammer would fall. And when it came heavy. 112 years to life. No parole, no second act. The judge made it clear, this man wasn't supposed to breathe air outside prison walls again.
Just a minute before, the judge socked Timmons with 112 years to life in prison.
But Bolden didn't flinch. According to people who were there, he took the sentence like he had taken beatings on the streets, like he had taken knives and fists inside Rikers, on the chin, without a tear, without a shake in his voice. For a man who had built his name off fear and violence, showing weakness in that moment would have been the real death sentence. And so, he stood steady, as if he knew that this was the only way his story could end. Behind the walls though, Bolden wasn't just another inmate. He was RonDu now, the name given to him through the 5% Nation. It meant he carried knowledge of self, a spiritual code that gave men like him another kind of authority inside. To some, he was still the ruthless predator who had once ripped gold teeth out of an old man's mouth, but to others, he had become a figure you could sit down with, reason with, even look up to. It was a paradox that ran through his entire life: fear and respect, destruction and wisdom, often living side by side in the same body. Survival in prison for a stick-up kid was complicated. The hustlers who ran drug empires on the streets could often buy protection or leverage their crews inside. A stick-up kid had no such luxury. They were hated as much as they were feared. Hustlers saw them as traitors, wolves who fed off the very system they had built. And if you robbed the wrong man on the outside, chances are his people would be waiting for you on the inside. RonDu knew this better than anyone. He had already survived one of those verdicts in blood. The day he landed on Rikers Island after robbing Fat Cat Nichols, he was nearly carved up. The stories say he took more than 150 stitches, and yet he lived, just like he always had. That survival came from the same raw energy that had carried him in the streets. One man who knew him inside told the story of being just 14 when he first crossed paths with RonDu on the streets. Bolden didn't scare him straight, but he didn't ignore him either. He pulled him aside, spoke to him, gave him a glimpse of the wisdom buried beneath the violence. Years later, when they crossed paths again in the Bronx House of Detention's CMC High Security Unit, that same man saw another side of Bolden. He wasn't preaching, but he was leading. He called it going to church, not for prayer, but for meetings, for strategy, for connection. In a place where everyone was watching their back, RonDu could still gather people to his side. But prison isn't built for legends. It's built to break them down. The longer Bolden stayed, the more his myth was locked in amber. He became one of those names you whispered about, not because of what he was doing now, but because of what he had done. His sentence had turned his life into a cautionary tale. To the younger generation, he was proof of where the stick-up life led. To his peers, he was both enemy and brother, a man who might send you to the infirmary if you crossed him, but who might also greet you with mad love and a care package if you were on his side.